My daughter-in-law called my hands disgusting at my own son's engagement party. She didn't whisper it. She said it loud enough for the 3 people standing next to her to hear. I was reaching across the table to pass the bread basket, and she looked at my hands, the knuckles swollen from 30 years of physical work, the skin rough and spotted. And she said, "God, those hands. I can't even look at them." My son Calvin was across the room talking to his college friend. He didn't hear it. I pulled my hands back and set them in my lap under the table. I didn't say anything. I just sat there and thought. So this is who she is. Her name was Brielle. She was 31, worked in pharmaceutical sales, wore clothes that cost more than my first car. She had the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no, the kind that tips over into cruelty without her even noticing. My son had been dating her for 14 months when he called to tell me he'd proposed. He sounded so happy. I told him I was happy too, and I meant it, because I didn't know her yet. Not really. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed electrician, then another 12 running my own contracting company before I sold it. I live alone in a 3-bedroom house in Raleigh, North Carolina. The same house where Calvin grew up. I drive a 2019 pickup truck that has a dent in the rear bumper from a Home Depot parking lot. I wear Wrangler jeans and New Balance sneakers. My reading glasses have a piece of tape on the left arm because I sat on them last spring and keep forgetting to replace them. I do not look like a man who has money. I have money. After I sold the company, after investments, after inheriting what my father left me, a man who spent 40 years quietly buying commercial real estate in 3 states, I have just under $48 million. I have never told anyone outside of my accountant and my attorney. My ex-wife doesn't know. My sister has a general sense that I'm comfortable, but not the number. Calvin, my son, who I love more than anything on this earth, does not know. I keep it that way on purpose. I watched what money does to people when they find out about it. I watched it happen to my father's second wife. I watched it happen to a cousin of mine after a lawsuit settlement. People stop seeing you. They start seeing the number. So I live the way I live, and I let people draw their own conclusions, and I've been mostly fine with that arrangement, until Brielle. After the engagement party, I told myself I'd imagined it. That she'd been nervous and it came out wrong. That everyone has a bad night. I drove home and stood in my kitchen for a long time and drank a glass of water and thought about all the reasons to give her the benefit of the doubt. Then I remembered the look on her face when she said it. It wasn't nervousness. It wasn't a slip. She was mildly disgusted and entirely unbothered by the fact that she'd expressed it out loud. Like swatting a fly. Automatic. I started paying closer attention after that. 3 weeks later, Calvin brought her to Raleigh for a weekend. She stood in my living room and looked around the way a building inspector looks at a property they've already decided to condemn. She picked up a framed photo of Calvin at his high school graduation and set it back down without comment. She asked me if the neighborhood had appreciated much, a question that had only one real meaning. When I showed her the back porch, which I'd built myself 20 years ago, she said, "It's sweet that you do things yourself," in a tone that made sweet sound like sad. At dinner that night, she told Calvin that she'd found a venue for the wedding. A resort in Asheville, roughly $8,000 just for the ceremony's base. She was describing the floral arrangements she wanted and the photographer whose work she'd fallen in love with, and the rehearsal dinner at a vineyard. And she glanced at me once during all of this. A quick flicker of a glance, calculating. Then she looked back at Calvin and kept talking. She never asked if I needed to sit down. She never asked what I thought. I was furniture. When Calvin walked her out to the car after dinner, I sat at the kitchen table and I made a decision. If my son was going to marry this woman, and he was, I could see it. He was completely in love. Then I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. Not a suspicion. Not a feeling. Evidence. I'm an electrician by trade and a contractor by profession. I know how to be patient. I know how to work a problem methodically. I know that the worst thing you can do is act before you understand the full picture, so I decided to give her a longer look. a real look. And I decided to make it as easy as possible for her to show me who she really was. I started walking with a cane. My left knee has given me minor trouble for years. Nothing serious. Just the accumulated wear of decades on job sites. I've never needed a cane. But I found one in the back of my closet, an old wooden one that belonged to my father, and I started using it when Brielle was around. I walked slower. I let myself seem a little confused sometimes. Not dramatically, just the kind of mild vagueness that people sometimes attribute to older men. I wore older clothes when I knew she'd be visiting. I mentioned, casually, in conversation, that I was watching my budget since I was on a fixed income. That last part was technically true. I do receive income on a fixed schedule from my investments. She heard fixed income the way she was meant to hear it. Within 2 weeks, something in her shifted. She stopped performing politeness. She got comfortable. And when people like Brielle get comfortable, you start to see the real architecture of who they are. She began making comments about the wedding that had a new quality to them, a directness that wasn't quite asking but was clearly expecting. She talked about what family is supposed to contribute in a tone that managed to exclude me from family, while also implying I should be grateful for the category. When Calvin mentioned that he wanted me to give a toast, she said, of course, just, keep it brief, and looked at me with something that I can only describe as tolerant dismissal. She called me Calvin's dad when she spoke about me to other people in my presence, not to be informal, to remind me of my exact position. 4 months before the wedding, Calvin told me she'd asked him whether I could help with costs. He was embarrassed asking. I could hear it in his voice. I told him, of course. What did they need? And he said Brielle had put together a list of expenses where family contributions would be appreciated. The list totaled $22,000. I didn't blink. I told Calvin I'd need a few weeks to move some things around. His voice relaxed immediately, and I hated that. Not at him, never at him, but at the situation, at what she'd engineered. I sent a check for $22,000 drawn on an account that listed my contracting company's old name, which sounds like a small business and nothing more. 2 weeks later, Brielle sent me a thank you text that said that was so generous of you. We know it's a lot. We know it's a lot. I read that text 4 times. I had also by this point started recording. Not secretly in any illegal sense. North Carolina is a one-party consent state, meaning I'm legally permitted to record conversations I'm participating in. I wear a small digital recorder in my breast pocket during every in-person interaction. I started keeping a document on my laptop, dates, quotes, context. Not because I had a plan yet. Just because I wanted the truth to be somewhere other than my own memory, which people can always dismiss. What I recorded over those 4 months, Brielle, at a Sunday lunch in February, telling Calvin in a low voice while I was in the kitchen, not low enough, that eventually we're going to need to think about what happens when he can't manage the house anymore. That property is worth something. We should talk to an estate attorney. Calvin murmured something I couldn't make out. She said, I'm just being practical. Brielle on the phone in my guest bathroom while I sat 12 feet away in the hallway. She didn't know the ventilation in that bathroom carries sound like a pipe. Telling someone, I assume her mother. He's sweet, but he's just this old guy living alone in this old house. Calvin is going to have to start managing his finances at some point. He has no idea how to handle money. He has no idea how to handle money. I sat in the hallway with my hands in my lap, my disgusting hands, and I breathed slowly and I did not move. Brielle, at a bridal shower planning session at my kitchen table, pointing to a catering menu and saying to her friend within clear earshot of me, we're not going to ask Calvin's dad about this part. He wouldn't understand the price points. She wasn't mean in an obvious way. That's the thing I want to be clear about. She wasn't yelling or cruel in the way that makes people immediately say, what a terrible person. She was exclusionary. She was quietly condescending. She managed me the way you manage a situation. Not a person, a situation that you're working around. I was a minor logistical inconvenience in the planning of her life, and she handled me accordingly. And Calvin, my wonderful, good-hearted son, didn't see it. Because she was warm to him. She was engaged and funny and affectionate. She loved him. I believe that, in the way that she was capable of it. She was just also a person who sorted other humans by their perceived usefulness and treated them accordingly. I am not a useful old man on a fixed income. That's what she thought she knew. The wedding was on a Saturday in October. The resort in Asheville was beautiful. I'll give her that. The mountains were in full color, orange and red and gold in every direction. The ceremony space was white stone and open sky, and exactly as expensive as it looked. I arrived early, and I sat in the front row on the groom's side, and I held my cane across my knees, and I wore my best suit, which is a gray wool suit I've had for 15 years and had dry cleaned twice. Brielle's mother walked past me before the ceremony and gave me the once-over and smiled the way people smile when they're being careful not to show what they actually think. I smiled back. My recorder was in my inside breast pocket, as it had been for 4 months. Calvin found me before he went to take his place at the altar. He was nervous and happy, and he looked like his mother around the eyes, which still catches me sometimes. He gripped my shoulder and said, "I'm really glad you're here, Dad." I said, "There's nowhere else I'd be." That was true. The ceremony was lovely. I am not being sarcastic. Whatever else was true about Brielle, she had organized something beautiful, and my son was radiantly happy at that altar. And I sat in the front row and watched him and felt the complicated mixture of pride and grief and love that I think all parents feel when their children stand up in front of the world and commit to someone else. I had not yet decided, sitting there, exactly what I was going to do. I had the recordings. I had the document. What I hadn't decided was whether to use them. Then came the reception. I was seated at table 3, the family table. But Brielle had arranged the seating so that I was at the end, with 2 of her college friends from Connecticut who were polite to me in the careful way that people are polite to someone they've been warned is limited. They asked me how I enjoyed retirement. They spoke over my head to each other when they thought something was too complex for me to follow. At one point, one of them asked me, with genuine kindness, if I needed help cutting my chicken. I said no. Thank you. I was fine. The first dance happened. Toasts happened. Calvin's best friend gave a speech that made the room laugh and then cry, which is the perfect order for these things. I had been told to keep my toast brief. I had a note card in my pocket that said 4 things. I love you. I'm proud of you. Take care of each other. That's all anyone needs to know. Then Brielle's father gave his toast. He talked for 11 minutes. I counted. He talked about Brielle's accomplishments, her career, her strength of character, her exceptional taste. He actually said exceptional taste, and her gift for building a life of quality. He talked about the family she came from and what they valued, and what they expected. He looked at Calvin for most of it, warmly, welcoming him into the exceptional quality of this family. He did not look at me once. At some point during his 11 minutes, something settled in me. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more final than anger. A kind of clarity. When it was my turn, I stood up. I picked up my note card and I looked at it for a moment. Then I set it down on the table. I said, I want to tell you all something I've never told anyone in this room. Actually, I've never told anyone, period. The room got quiet the way rooms do when someone's tone signals that something unexpected is about to happen. I said, for the past several months, I've been listening. That's something I've always been good at, listening. Paying attention. My father taught me that the most important thing you can know about a person isn't what they say to your face. It's what they say when they think you can't hear them, or when they think you don't matter. Calvin was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Brielle was watching me too, very still. I said, I'm going to play something for you now. I apologize in advance for the audio quality. I reached into my breast pocket and I took out the recorder and I connected it to the small Bluetooth speaker I had set on the table, which everyone had assumed was a decoration or a phone speaker, and I pressed play. The first thing that played was Brielle in the bathroom. He's sweet, but he's just this old guy living alone in this old house. Calvin is going to have to start managing his finances at some point. He has no idea how to handle money. I watched Calvin's face. I watched it change. I played 40 seconds. I stopped it. The room was absolutely silent. I said, I want to be clear that I'm not playing this to ruin this day. I'm playing it because I love my son, and I believe he deserved to know who he's standing next to. I have 2 hours of recordings. I kept them because I'm a methodical person and because I hoped I was wrong. I wasn't wrong. Brielle said my name. Just my name. I looked at her. I said, my name is Howard Garrett. I worked as an electrician for 31 years. I built my business from a single truck and a tool belt. I sold that company in 2019. Before that, my father spent 40 years acquiring commercial real estate across 3 states, and when he died, he left most of it to me. My net worth as of last quarter is approximately $48 million. I paused. I live the way I live because I like my life, and because I learned a long time ago that money tells you nothing about a person, but how someone treats a man they think has nothing that tells you everything. I looked at my son. I said, I love you. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry you found out like this. I sat down. What happened next is hard to describe linearly because several things happened at the same time. Calvin stood up and walked out of the room. Brielle's mother made a sound. Brielle herself sat very still for a long moment, and then said something to her father in a low voice, and then stood and followed Calvin. The rest of the reception did not continue in any organized fashion. I sat at table 3 and I finished my piece of wedding cake, which was lemon with lavender frosting and was genuinely very good. One of the Connecticut friends asked me, in a shell-shocked voice, if any of that was true. I said yes. She stared at me. I offered her the rest of my cake, which she declined. Calvin called me that night from a hotel room. He had been crying. He asked me why I hadn't told him sooner. Not about the money, about Brielle. I told him the truth because I could see he loved her, and I wanted to be sure, and I wanted him to be sure, and I didn't want to be the father who cost him something based on a feeling. He asked me about the recordings, and I told him all of it. From the beginning. From the engagement party and the bread basket in her hand pulling back from mine. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the hands comment. I said, yes. He said, she told me you'd misheard her. I said, I know. He said, Dad, I'm so sorry. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. I told him that's the thing about people like Brielle. They're very good at what they do. They don't show you everything at once. My son did not go on his honeymoon. He came and stayed with me in Raleigh for 10 days instead. And we watched football and I cooked the things he liked when he was a boy. And we talked, really talked, more than we had in years. The divorce was finalized 7 months after the wedding. Brielle's attorney initially pushed for a settlement that referenced my finances, which I found predictable. The settlement she received had nothing to do with my money because my money was never marital property. My son had nothing to do with it and never had. That conversation went quickly. Calvin is doing well. He moved to Durham, about 30 minutes from me, and we have dinner most Sundays. He's been seeing someone new for the past couple of months. A kindergarten teacher named Dana, who came to Sunday dinner last month and spent 20 minutes asking me about my father's real estate holdings because she was genuinely curious, not because she was calculating, and who helped me clear the table without being asked. I like her. My hands still look the way they look. 31 years on job sites will do that. Last Sunday, Calvin reached across the dinner table to grab the bread basket and accidentally brushed my hand and then stopped and looked at it for a moment and then looked at me, and I knew what he was thinking about. I said, "Pass the butter too, if you don't mind." He laughed. It sounded like relief. I've thought a lot in the months since about whether I did the right thing, whether the reception was the right moment, whether there was a quieter way. But here's what I keep coming back to. I gave her every chance. I was patient, the way my father taught me to be patient. I watched and I listened, and I documented and I waited, and every single time I gave her the chance to be a different kind of person, she chose the same path. Not once did she ask me anything real. Not once did she look at me like I was a full human being whose life had weight and history and meaning. She looked at me like I was a problem to manage. So I let her manage me, right up until I didn't. I am 64 years old. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I've tried to live quietly and treat people the way my father taught me to treat them. Like, their value has nothing to do with what they own or what they look like or how steady their hands are. My father built a real estate portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars and died in the same modest house he'd lived in for 40 years. He drove a Buick. He wore a digital watch. He used to say, "Howard, the size of a man's life isn't in his wallet. It's in how many people at his funeral knew his real name." At his funeral, the church was standing room only. That's the inheritance he left me. The 48 million was just the part that came with paperwork. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, more than I expected to need. People ask me, when I tell pieces of the story, which I rarely do, whether I feel guilty about the way it ended, whether I think about Brielle and what that moment cost her, whether I regret not pulling Calvin aside privately instead of letting a room full of people hear it all at once. I do think about it. I'm not a person who acts without thinking about the weight of what he's done. But here's what I keep landing on. I didn't create that moment. I only revealed it. Everything Brielle lost at that reception she had already chosen to lose, over and over, across months of small decisions she made freely when she thought it didn't count. That's the thing about character. It doesn't reveal itself in the big moments. It reveals itself in the bathroom phone calls, in the breadbasket comments, in the way you speak about someone when you're certain they can't hear you and don't matter anyway. I spent 31 years as an electrician before I built anything bigger. I know what it looks like when a foundation is wrong. You can put the most beautiful structure on top of it, the right address, the right photographs, the right dress, and it will still fail, because what's underneath was never sound. Brielle was building on a foundation of conditional respect. She respected people proportional to what she thought they could do for her. That's not love. That's a transaction with a smile on it. And transactions eventually come due. What I want Calvin to understand, what I hope he's starting to understand now, over Sunday dinners and past bread baskets, is that none of this was his fault, and none of it means he made a foolish mistake by loving her. He loved what she showed him. That's all any of us can do. The failure wasn't in his vision. It was in what she chose to hide. Wisdom, I think, isn't about seeing through people. That's just suspicion. And suspicion makes for a cold and exhausting life. Real wisdom is patience. It's the willingness to watch long enough, quietly enough, without rushing to either judgment or comfort. My father had it. He never made a real estate deal without sitting on it. He used to say that a property always tells you who it is if you give it enough time and walk the whole perimeter before you sign anything. People are the same way. I walked the whole perimeter. I gave it enough time. I kept my hands in my lap and my recorder in my pocket, and I waited until I knew, not suspected, not feared, knew what I was dealing with. That's not coldness. That's the discipline to let truth arrive on its own terms, instead of forcing it into a shape you can live with. The courage part, for me, wasn't standing up at that reception. That part was actually easier than I expected, once I decided. The courage was the months before it. Sitting at those dinners, hearing those phone calls, watching my son look at her with that expression on his face, and not flinching. Staying steady. Trusting that the right moment would come, and that I would know it when it did. It did. I knew. Calvin's going to be all right. Better than all right. He has more of his grandfather in him than he knows. That quiet steadiness, that basic goodness. Dana sees it. I saw it the night she helped me clear the table without being asked. That's a small thing. And small things are everything. I still have the tape on my reading glasses. I keep meaning to replace them.